I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Molly Merson, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice in Berkeley, California, and a psychoanalytic candidate at the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. Published by Trapart Books, 2019, and also available as an ebook through iBooks and Kindle. For more information, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You may also visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, and the podcast website, renderingunconscious.org. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode.
Spaces such as these are becoming increasingly rare and increasingly necessary. Places where we can really just talk and let our minds flow and associate, especially because there's like just sort of what we were talking about, this like heightened sense of like border delineation, but also simultaneously, I think, a sense of permeability, intrusion, what's inside, what's outside. And there's, so it's kind of like this idea even of how can our minds even conceptualize of free association as linked to our mouths to speak it. I mean, it's, these are really tough times. And the truth is it's always been, that especially in the States, it's like, and certainly globally too, but it's always been really difficult to tell the truth. And so much of this country, anyway, the history of it is about who gets to do that and who believes it. I feel like there's so much work that we are having to do to unravel all of that.
There's so much work to do.
Yeah. And it's amazing too how like we just continue to cling, I think, to, because it seems like the alternative then is like everything falls apart, and there is a very large part of me that thinks that's just fine, and there's another part of me that's like, oh, that would probably harm people who are not me more than me. Right? Like, there are people who actually like really, really need an intact system and structure in order to survive. Sadly, those are usually the folks that system and structure fails. So it's complicated. Like, I think that's one of the things I'm learning most in my work right now is like how I kind of start off with this burn it down feeling. I sort of start with this like rage, and like once I find out the truth about injustice, for example, specifically, I'm just like kind of like fuck this, big time. But I'm also recognizing that that's a reflection of my privilege to be able to do that. And I need to find a way to translate that into some way to communicate and actually strategize and have like a long game in mind that doesn't have to come from me, but comes from collaborative spaces. Get strategic. I need to get strategic.
Everybody does. Strategic and long-term.
And long-term, exactly. And collaborative, like we need each other. And so yes. So I'm looking for spaces like that where and I think, it's interesting, people kind of disparage the interweb, because they say it's like, not real relationships and cutting, I don't know what people say, but like some people don't like it. And I think it's actually made it so, I wouldn't have met you otherwise. It's made it so that people can come together and get to know each other and have spaces for these kind of transformative conversations. It's also a place that can increase paranoia and denial. But I feel like it, depending on who's in the space, it can, or what voices are in the space, it can really be, I've found it to be very generative. Sometimes something will happen, in the bigger picture, and I'll kind of go to Twitter because I'm not exactly sure. I'm like, I know what I think about it, but I'm not exactly sure how might this impact people that aren't me, or people that I'm not speaking to directly that day. And it's been so helpful to hear like, oh yeah, like, this is how, a climate change focused person would think about it. This is how, Kimberly Crenshaw would think about it. This is how, and it's just sort of like, oh yeah, okay. Like so many different ways to think about this stuff that I think only enhances the dyad. Like I'm thinking about a psychoanalytic dyad, clinical dyad. I think having more and more voices like just completely enhances that, because it brings so many, there's the whole, Ogden's third and everything, but there's so much more than that. The third is not a monolith.
What's the psychoanalytic scene like where you are?
It's very vibrant. There are a lot of people involved in psychoanalysis, both in terms of like your standard training model. Like we have two sort of traditionally quote unquote Freudian training institutes. We have a Lacanian training institute and we have a Jungian training institute, all in the Bay Area. So Ohlone territory. And so it's very vibrant. We also have NCSPP, Northern California Society for Psychoanalytic Psychology, which is sort of a, clearinghouse, if you will, of like all sorts of different psychoanalytic thinkers. So it's big. And then there are people who are sort of on the, not affiliated with any of the institutes, training institutes, but who are very vibrant in psychoanalytic thinking. Because we have like postdoc training institutes that are, and postmasters training institutes that are psychoanalytically focused. So it's very alive. So I just gave a talk with a couple of folks I'm in my third year of training, And a couple folks in my cohort and I gave a talk on whiteness, interrogating whiteness in psychoanalysis. And we gave that talk at our institute, and then it was also live streamed. The past president of our institute also joined us for this talk. And as far as I'm aware, and this is me showing the limits of my historical knowledge, but as far as I'm aware, it's the first time that whiteness was put on the stage in that particular way at our institute. And again, I could be wrong, and I want somebody to correct me if I am. But to center whiteness in order to deconstruct it, I don't think certainly doesn't happen as often as I would like in psychoanalysis, but certainly, people have been talking about it. But the fact that we were able to do that and we had 90 attendees, almost half of those were live stream, was like, oh, okay, like, that's not that many people, but that's a lot of people, because you kind of have to self-select into something like that, right?
Yeah, it's psychoanalysis. In New York, we, at like the Umberhagen events, we usually get like 40 people, 50 people, and that's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, it was totally amazing. And so, yeah, it was amazing to have that many people attend a talk like that. And I wasn't sure what the reception would be. I worked really hard to figure out how to say what I needed to say about whiteness, because it's so very easy for whiteness talk to replicate whiteness and for things to get enacted that are actually extremely traumatizing and painful. And I haven't heard from everyone who attended, but the feedback that I got from people I know was that it really helped to demonstrate how we have to talk about our own personal story in such a way that isn't about highlighting somebody else's pain in order to prove a point, but how we are actually, and I and other people I've spoken to who identify as white, how it's really, really important to like be able to come at this from your own history and the ways in which, like for me, I told the stories of, how I was raised and where I'm from, and how much of whiteness was steeped into just the, physical, structural, architectural environment of where I came from. And how even though nobody was talking about it, people were only talking about race in the context of the quote unquote other, which is always interesting to me what that means. Like, thinking about the other is usually from a white perspective. But that I have to go back into my own history and kind of overlay a whiteness interrogation onto my own past and my own family dynamics, and in what ways were we replicating whiteness. And I don't think institutes do that very well with psychoanalysis. I don't think that psychoanalysis gets that kind of interrogation around its own whiteness and like how the theories get formulated from a very specific perspective that plays into all of these power structures. There's a narrative that psychoanalysis is, radical, and I think that is true. But something that's radical has to stay radical. The whole point is, in some ways, to put ourselves out of business, right? Because we're helping people know themselves and do their own analytic work and whatever, and helping communities do this. But I think sometimes psychoanalysis can get self-fulfilling and self-referential. And I think in part it's because we could really benefit from doing some of some deep interrogation around like sort of the contextualization of psychoanalysis. And people talk about that like in terms of the social and, you know, like sociocultural and sociopolitical, socioeconomic. I think whiteness needs to get in there too, and be thought about.
The thing that always made me the most crazy about what psychoanalysis has done to itself is like the insane, rigorous like entry that anyone has to go through to be able to get into psychoanalysis. Like you have to make sure they're not psychotic, and you have to make sure this and this isn't going to happen or is going to happen, and you're supposed to tell the analysians that they can't change anything in their lives while they're in analysis because they might change their mind again. I mean, they taught us that at my institute. Yeah. And I was just like, you know, I did it at the time because that's what we were taught to do. And then as the like longer I was like helping people with analysis, I was like, this is crazy. And I actually had my very first analysis, who I of course won't say anything about. The only thing that I will say is that she, you know, got to a point where she wanted to really radically change her life because she wanted to, because, you know, that happens sometimes. That could be very healthy. And my supervisor actually was like, you can't let her do that. And I was like, what? And I was like, I'm not saying anything. And he's like, you have to stop her. And I was like, what? And I was like, this is the most unanalytic supervision ever. You're telling me I have to stop her from making radical changes in her life when she's like, you know, been in a miserable job forever and etc., you know?
Holy shit.
Yeah. I find that really strange. And I also find it really arrogant that psychoanalysts or psychoanalysis thinks that it's like, I mean, I think it can be really, you know, amazing. I mean, it's completely changed my life and helped me a lot when I had my first analysis and second and third. But I think the idea that like you're going to cause a psychotic episode in somebody or something, like it's dangerous, I think that's really strange. I don't think someone's going to go psychotic from talking about their lives and going into their fantasies and dreams and stuff. I just don't think so. Sorry.
Wow. It's remarkable. I mean, and what you said about that being the most unanalytic supervision you've ever had is like, I also think that psychoanalytic training is quite unanalytic. Exactly. And interestingly, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, I feel so confused. And when I get confused, I complain. So we can talk to Sarah Ahmed about that. Like, you know, complaint is a feminist act. But also it's like, I'm sitting here being like, okay, like you're asking me to open up, and, you know, me personally as a candidate, you know, I'm like getting into my own everything. Because we have what they call a tripartite model, I guess, where it's like you have your seminar, you have your cases, and then you have your own analysis. And so all that's happening at the same time. And there's like several layers within all of those things. But although I did hear recently, like some institutes, like some in Europe, actually require your analyst to approve you to start analytic training. Mm-hmm. You have to have been in analysis for a couple of years before you're allowed to start training. So when you were just talking about, you know, the sort of the clinical work that you were doing, I thought you were about to talk about the barriers to entry for a candidate. To become an analyst, you know, to be in analytic
They're
training.
Parallel, right?
They are
parallel.
Exactly. And the whole idea about like who's analyzable and who's not, I mean, that completely depends on your structure and your context. A person who, everybody is going to need something a little bit different, right? And if all you have is this very sort of like old-fashioned, you know, let's take a tiny little piece of the Oedipus myth and make a whole theory about it. If you're just looking at that, then yeah, there's going to be so many people who don't fit into that. That just do not, and like to try to make them fit is doing something like what you are naming of like continuing to oppress a person who wants to make radical changes. And it's like, isn't analysis, you know, supposed to be about being alive, being alive in relationship to aspects of a self and a community. And um, witnessing, I guess, it's like participating in, being a member of, I don't know, these are not quite the right words, but when somebody wants to make a change, to do the thing and then have space for process, right? Like, okay, so let's think about this together. Okay, like you did this thing. What was that like? I mean, isn't that what we're trying to do as humans? Rather than like, these are the rules and you have to stay within these rules. I mean, it drives me bananas. It's so harmful. It's so harmful and so limiting and makes me so sad because psychoanalysis, and I hear this from people, and I heard this from Kimberlyn Leary, like psychoanalysis is personal and it can change your life, right? And that's why we're in it. We're in this because it's helped us. Not because of the rules or the like pat theories. Sometimes I know exactly when somebody is just, and by somebody I mean my analyst, is just repeating a theory. I'm like, I read that too. But it's like there's something else that gets to happen. And this is what can get so missed, right? From training institutes is like, something else gets to happen in psychoanalysis that cannot, that actually, I mean, I was going to say can't happen anywhere else, but that's not even true. That's the myth. It's something that does happen in other places. And in psychoanalysis, we get to figure out what our own meaning is. We get to make meaning out of something, and we get to play around with meaning because it's like, like what I'm saying to you right here today, I mean, this is all iterative, right? Like I'm going to probably have a different opinion, next year, or have thought about this differently, or some of this I'm saying for the first time. So I don't really even know yet, So it's like, and that's a psychoanalytic process where it's like, we can say things and we can be curious about it. We don't have to live by it. We don't have to be like, oh, wow, well, I made that decision, or I said that thing. So now it's like, I always have to say that thing. We don't actually have to freeze anything. It can be growthful. And that means we can say things that we say and we go, wow, I don't even agree with that. And yet there's a part of me that said it out loud, and it's like, and if there is harm, ideally it gets to be processed. But if the analyst and the institute and the field, the theory, isn't willing to engage in their own sort of interrogation of themselves, then growth cannot happen. It's like I have a garden. I grow a lot of food in the garden and flowers. And it's like the ground has to be workable for the plant to grow. If it's too impacted, if if no new nutrients have been put in, the soil doesn't just regenerate on its own if you're extracting from it. So one of the things, I'll just share something about one of my supervisors that I have. So the supervisor and I are talking about, he sent me this paper from Usha Tumalanara about like cultural competency in case presentation or something like that. She's awesome, great person. And also like her writing is really great because I feel like I can kind of read between the lines with a lot of these psychoanalytic theorists and writers when they're trying to say something on several levels. And because I can identify with like, I have a message that's kind of like, I'm really annoyed and that's my message. But I'm trying to say it in a way that's like formulaic, so I'm sure I'm reading into it, but I feel an identification with the like, oh yeah, this is where you're really just trying to make sure that certain people are able to hear. Anyway, we were talking about that, and my supervisor was like, so I assigned this paper for some class, and my supervisor was like, I don't know. I realized I don't know how to teach it. And I said, well, maybe you teach the paper by demonstrating what the paper is talking about, which is social location, figuring out what's actually important to you about this paper and where you're coming from and why that's important. And some places where you feel like you might need more education or information or things that you don't know or with, whatever. Like, I feel like that's, and the supervisor is white, and I feel like that's, so he started laughing and he goes, oh, I said, why are you laughing? And he said, oh, because you did that when you were giving your presentation. You went into a personal story to illustrate something about how we have to make this personal, not objectified. We can't tokenize, like Black folks, for example. We can't tokenize, certain struggles. We have to actually go into our own story and be vulnerable. And he's like, you're asking me to do that with this group of people I've never met, to go into my story and tell it as it pertains to this paper that I assigned and why I assigned it. And he said, that is really scary. And I said, yeah. And keep in mind, I wrote 12 versions of that talk before I gave it. So what I ended up sharing was not so raw that I had worked on it. And for me, that's the thing about psychoanalysis, is like, it gives us an opportunity to iterate, to work through, to be like, okay, like, this is a thing and it's really scary at first, and then it's maybe a little less scary, and then maybe a little less scary, and then actually, oh, now I can actually hold this as a part of myself rather than feel attacked by it. And I think for a lot of white folks who are trying to do work around their own whiteness, it's a very similar kind of process of like, yeah, I can't teach this paper written by, a South Asian person, and just sort of teach it as a thing out in the world. I have to go inside myself and figure out, how does this resonate for me? And also, what about my own life? Not just like what of myself can I see in someone else's story, but what about my own story has contributed to the pain that this person is talking about? What about my own story has created the need for a paper about quote unquote cultural competency, which, the languaging around that we can talk about, but what has created a need for this paper specifically? Why does this paper become the other paper? Like, what is it about my location and where I'm at? And this is where I wish that our analysts would do this more and our institutes would do this more. Like, what is it about just even existing, in this shape? How did we come to be? What are all the parts that go into that are not only about what was passed down transgenerationally, individually, and familially, but structurally and socially? Mm-hmm. How did my ancestors get to be white when they immigrated? Like, how did that happen? And then someone else's parents didn't get to be that. And so what has that opened up for me, and like all these sorts of things. So I feel like psychoanalysis it's so fascinating, and it's so amazing, and it's so transformative, and also it's so powerful, I think, that people just shut down because then they can't control it at a certain point. So one of the things that I learned pretty early on in my analytic training is that there are no heroes, and everybody is human, and even people whom I absolutely 100% admire and like would follow anywhere, like they have flaws. And actually realizing that helped me be a better clinician and a better human because I didn't feel anymore like I had to buy into this, like, I have to be perfect. I have to, have a status. I have to, always do what people want me to do. And, I feel pretty grateful about having learned that early on, even though it's a really tough lesson to learn because I fell pretty hard. And there's so many tools that power can use, like, and whiteness is one of them, right? And it's like power for power's sake, and who has access to that. It's like, yeah, I think especially, I think about it, in the context of whiteness, just because that's where I'm saturated right now. But it's like, if you have something that was surreptitiously gained, or problematically gained, then that, you can't actually, it's not actually yours. Like all the land in the United States is like not actually ours. It's not actually private property. It's settler, it's colonized and stolen. And so it's like when we have this, and so is the labor. The labor is stolen, and the economy has been stolen off of the backs of people who never got paid and were tortured. And it's just like when we have that, it's not a real having of a thing. It's like, oh, at least I'm not that person. At least I'm not lower or whatever. Like in this case, at least I'm not the candidate. The candidate can just kind of figure it out. And eventually, when I die, the candidate will be in my position, like, this kind of weird nepotism thing. But then it's also like, you hold on. I think we hold on tighter when they're ill-gotten gains. And it means that we don't think anymore. It means that we lose humility, we lose empathy, we increase narcissistic wound, personal wounds as well as wounding other people. And it's just so devastating and harmful. And it's like, somebody who has amassed their fortune but then becomes completely paranoid of losing it and then just sits on top of their money, and you find their corpse 100 years later on top of the pile of money. It's, I mean, I don't know where that fantasy is coming from, but like, it's just kind of, yeah, it's just, and it's like, wow, no wonder like our planet is dying. No wonder we are killing each other. No wonder there's like, just all this fucking violence and racism and trauma. And, even like so if the conference goes on, in a week and a half, which I'm hoping that it does. And, there's been so much work put into it. One of the panels I'm on, it's a roundtable about reparations. And, it's like, how hard is it to even have that conversation about reparations for descendants of slaves or enslaved people, right? It's like people who were forcibly, carted. I mean, it's just the fucking trauma it runs deep, and it's in the blood of our country. And our country, can't talk about it.
Refuses.
Refuses. And distorts the conversation. And, it's just like, it's amazing. Just the fact that we are going to, the idea is kind of like folks are going to watch us have a conversation about it. And that is like, the fact that is so revolutionary pisses me off, like but so just kind of looping that back into power and how, the institutes, like, can't help, I think, but be looped into these bigger issues of power, especially how power was manifest in this country and is manifest. It's like, it's just like, how could it not be related? How could this stuff not be echoes of, the fact that this land, was brutally stolen, and, people were stolen and brought here, and, forced labor, and I mean, it's just not even that, but families torn apart. I mean, it's just like layers upon layers.
Yeah, and
And
until it's addressed, nothing's ever going to get fixed.
nothing, nothing's ever going to change. And the truth, I think the truth is that we have, like, stuff has to strategically fall apart. And, it's sort of like in a clinical situation where, let's say somebody, like, I work a lot with folks with eating disorders, right? So it's like, let's say somebody has like a go-to, let's say they binge, right? So they have a go-to of, like, when they have emotional stress, they go to this particular thing, right? And it's like, you can say, like, okay, take away that particular thing. Don't do that, which is a lot of what, some sort of more CBT approach would be, like, okay, don't do that thing. But it's like, until there's like a reckoning with the actual emotional cycle of what's happening inside the person, and a different thing that can provide a different kind of feedback loop, unless those two things are happening simultaneously, as well as process around, like, okay, what happens when the person goes toward that harmful thing, then it's like, then nothing is, you can't, but you can't imagine what this less harmful thing would be unless you're actually grappling with the pain and the trauma and the emotional landscape. And this is why people push back so hard against psychoanalysis. And this is where psychoanalysis shuts down, when it has access to that kind of power, the kind of power that is a colonizing power. It's about othering. It's about dividing. It's about this kind of fucked up epistemophilic kind of, like, I have to know, like, there's one thing. And, I mean, for my institute is pluralistic, and there are a lot of, we are exposed to a lot of different sort of viewpoints about things. Supervision is pretty, you can find a supervisor who would fit any particular type of psychoanalytic theory that you might be interested in. So we're really, I think that's really awesome. And yet, like, we are so white. We are so white. And that is a problem, because, well, for very obvious reasons, but it's just how much I can't presume to know. So that's, for me, that's like one of the limitations, and I'm grateful that my institute is willing to look at things. After the talk we gave last week, last week, we got a letter from the president sent out to all of membership that, they're taking it really seriously, and they started like some kind of task force or something to focus on, race and inclusion in the curriculum and in the faculty and in the institute. So the fact that people are, like, willing to, at least willing to start doing something, feels really important. And that said, it's a pervasive issue, I think, across all institutions, especially ones that, I don't know about your institute, but mine's all volunteer run. So that adds like a whole other layer.
Yeah, I think it's the same.
Mm-hmm.
They all volunteered their time to teach. And
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's like, that's where it's people's personal, both generosity and conviction, where they would volunteer to teach, volunteer to be on committees, volunteer to lead, volunteer to do all of that. And there's a lot of layers in there. I think psychoanalysis can be so transformative, and I love it so much, and it has given me so much. Like, I feel so fed by it. I have grown, and been able to, like, just really more fully participate in my life and in the world. And I don't think it has to be, the way it is. And I think that there are ways that psychoanalysis, if we're thinking about this on a social level, it can be so transformative. It could really help us bring. My institute has this really cool new track called the Community Psychoanalysis track, where the institute recognizes that there is such thing as community psychoanalysis. That's been happening. It's been happening for a very long time, and we are plugged in. And so people do a training case that is working at that, in that community setting. And it's like, that is so cool. And if we could do more of that on a bigger scale, maybe people could afford psychoanalysis. Maybe clinicians could afford to do psychoanalysis. Maybe, to provide it. Maybe training would be less restrictive. Maybe even the idea of who's analyzable would become more complex, because, again, it means that, it really depends on context and what you're including in your concept of what psychoanalysis is. And it doesn't have to be this one-on-one, dyadic, private, thing. And it doesn't have to have anything to do with Oedipus. It can be something else. I have a colleague who is working on revising, doing a different take on the Oedipus myth, where she's talking about how it might be representative of whiteness and other systems of power. And it's just like, can we dig back in, to psychoanalysis and actually, like, revive its radical roots ourselves. So that is an ongoing project. You can't stay radical if it's just the same people saying the same things over and over again.
Yeah, and
identity ego is first formed,
memorizing that and repeating child's experience.
Exactly. Then that is the moment it's no longer radical.
Image appears.
It's supposed to be about everybody finding their voice and speaking.
That's right. Yes. And I feel so grateful that I'm getting that opportunity, but I feel like I've really had to fight for it. And that's partly me and my history. It's partly my privilege. It's partly that I'm being encouraged,
Current representation.
But also, I wouldn't be able to stay. I wouldn't be able to stay in this training if I were not doing that. I would feel smothered.
Geissenberg
you need a lot of support.
Cutting of language creates the space for
I was very happy. I went to my first analysis was when I was in grad school, and he was a candidate. And I was really glad that I had that analysis already for like 4 years, because if my training analysis had been my first analysis, I would have a really bad taste in my mouth, basically. Because it was really like authoritarian. And then I ended up having a Lacanian analysis after that to work through all the trauma from my training analysis.
Relaxation.
I'm in that position now where I'm starting. So my training analysis is pretty much done. So I'm thinking about what I want to do next in terms of, do I want another analysis, or do I want to try something completely different? I don't know. I was thinking about, I read a couple papers from Griffin Hansberry, who's out in New York, and I went to his website. He seems really cool. I love his papers. Like, I just cried, actually, when I read the most recent one. But his website says that he does EMDR and psychoanalysis, and I'm just like, right? Like that's how is that not psychoanalytic?
Nor constructed.
Because it's really about this internal state of being, right? About like encouraging us to find our voice and encouraging, us to like find a way to be with ourselves and with the world and all of its complexities and multitudes.
Every cell.
So I don't know, it's just refreshing, and then Orna, Brown has her TV show, and it's just like there's all these different ways that it doesn't have to be, like you said, regurgitating canon.
Sexuality is not another realm by the unconscious sexuality.
I know, I found that out.
That was so amazing when I found that out.
I know. I read one of the articles that he wrote, like, I don't know, maybe a couple of years ago for the Vanishing New York. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. Like in the New Yorker, right? I think it was something like that. And then we read one of Griffin's papers in one of our intersubjectivities classes. And then I was like doing some research, like I want to know more about who this person is because of the way he writes. And he's just like, finally a paper that I can relate to that feels contemporary. And I found that link, like I found, when I Googled him, it's like, oh shit, I read that already. It's so cool. Yeah, I mean, I'm really hungry for that kind of stuff. I'm super hungry for like, it's really, really hard to translate some of what Freud talks about to the people I actually see in my practice. Yeah.
Can you come to Copenhagen?
Oh my gosh, I would love to.
You should come to Copenhagen if you can.
I've never been.
Yeah, I'm doing a conference all about psychoanalytic community outside of the institutes. And Laura's going to come.
Really?
Yeah.
When is it?
It's July 24th to 26th.
Oh my gosh. I am so tempted.
Think about it.
That is so rad. That's
fun.
so awesome. So are you doing do you do like a lot of different events? Like it seems like whenever I see you on Twitter, like you're letting us all know about the different things that you're doing. And I'm just like,
that's pretty much all I do now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is the first one that we're going to have like internationally. Like a group of people that would like meet with us had one in Iceland a few years ago. But they didn't specifically like frame it under this, like, we called ourselves Das Unbehage. This is Das Unbehagen in their culture. Yeah, so it's like civilization. I've
been on that email list in the past.
Yeah, so civilization and its discontents, and we were the discontent with the psychoanalytic civilization. Basically, it was our idea.
Nice.
Yeah, so we're having a little conference, international conference. And I'm inviting more people from like Sweden and Denmark and different places around here to kind of meet with the New Yorkers and whoever else wants to come.
That's so great.
But it's going to be pretty small because the theater only seats 65. So I think I'm only going to have like 50 people. Because I wanted to be like a giant process group weekend, basically.
Yeah.
Where we can all actually like talk. Not like people giving papers and people listening and then going, oh, that's great. But like people actually like having conversations. That's the idea.
Well, that is one way to disrupt whiteness and power, right? If everything is sort of equalized, like, and like redistributed, like that is so amazing. And then to have a space like that to do it in, that is just incredible.
Yeah,
have you found
donating the space for us?
See, that's the other thing about being in the States is that it's really hard, and it's not impossible because some communities have been working on this for a very long time, right? How to redistribute resources to a community level and like sort of, equalize, if you will, that power. So there are spaces in which these things happen. There are community centers, but in the psychoanalytic world, it seems increasingly difficult to find spaces that can really help facilitate conversation. Even my whiteness panel had to be a panel. We wanted it to be a circle where we were all talking together, but it had to be a panel because of the architecture of the space. So if because of the architecture of the space, if we had had a circle, we could have had only half as many people there. So there's an attendance problem, a limit there. And then because we were live streaming it, we had to have the video camera facing us. And there's a single camera, so it would have been very difficult to move that camera all around, to try and like video the people talking. So I'm thinking about, just even the space of a movie theater, and I'm thinking that maybe all the seats are pointing toward a stage, so there is still that kind of setup, but like the psychoanalytic architecture too, and like how does that facilitate space and how does that facilitate conversation? It's not very blank slate, it's actually quite already imbued with something.
I just finished the book I've been working on yesterday, and there's this great quote by Freud, who, because of what you were talking about before, when they were having all of the discussions about lay analysis and all of these kinds of things and training and institutional training and everything.
Yeah.
And Freud gave his perspective on the situation, and it goes along with what you were saying. This is how he ended his paper to address their whole wanting to regulate and have only physicians be analysts and all of that kind of thing. He said, "It is by no means so important what decision you give on the question of lay analysis. It may have a local effect, but the things that really matter, the possibilities in psychoanalysis for internal development, can never be affected by regulations and prohibitions."
That's radical right there. That's it.
That's it.
And except that it can prohibit who is allowed into authorized institutional spaces. And so it unfortunately we could consider that what Freud is saying positions somebody as having a choice, but in fact, it actually can mean that somebody doesn't have a choice and so has to do it in, quote unquote, lay analysis training, because it's really about access. I think he would be right if access were equitable, but it's not. And so I think that actually changes. I like the sentiment, but I don't think it's accurately representational of power structures and who's allowed into the spaces and who isn't.
Exactly.
Or who finds themselves reflected in the spaces and who doesn't.
But that's why he wanted people to be able to train as lay analysts, and he wanted free clinics to offer psychoanalysis.
I know that is like, I mean, I hear the NHI kind of does some, or was doing some stuff like that, which is cool. I don't know whether that will still happen now, but I am so into that. Like, I would love to figure out how to do that.
When we started Dasenbachen, that was one of our big goals. Jameson and I wanted to start some sort of free clinic or training program, but it's so complicated in the U.S. It's just like, I mean, there must be a way, but you have to really, like, I don't know.
So that's
it's bigger than me.
That's where it falls apart. That's where it's a good idea what he's saying, but that, like, can it really exist except in fantasy? Is this place where I don't think psychoanalysis has really taken up seriously enough, which is what I like about, how Pink is doing this community psychoanalysis track, where candidates are involved in a community psychoanalysis that already exists. And there gets to be like mutual authorization happening there, right? Because those agencies have already gone through all the regulations and all of that, sort of whatever stuff, the authorization from the state. And so we can kind of plug into that. But it's like, you know, in some ways, these agencies are kind of like what you described as your training experience, where it's just like working 3 different places, you know, 50, 60 hours a week, and then being like told, like, why do you rely on your paycheck? You know, I mean, it's like, yeah, it's, the United States is pretty messed up.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to do. But that also goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning, and like finding these collaborative spaces to work, because that would be the way to do it, is to find
Yes.
community spaces that are already set up, like logistically, and willing to work with people who are wanting to train as analysts, and find people that want to be in analysis, and have it all work for everybody. Like have everybody
Totally.
benefit from the structures coming together.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I think that's the dream, right? Is like that then folks who are clinicians at community agencies can be, you know, considered candidates in an analytic training program. The whole everything would have to be shaped differently, right? Because these training institutes are shaped for a particular iteration of psychoanalysis, which is the private model. But you'd have to reshape it. You know, and that's totally possible, and like so amazing to consider doing that. So, but it takes time, I think. It takes time and like we were talking about, you know, strategy to be able to do that.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Molly Merson. For more, please visit her website, mollymerson.com. That's MOLLYMERSON.com. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. Published by Trapart Books, 2019, and also available as an ebook through iBooks and Kindle. For more information, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You may also visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, and the podcast website, renderingunconscious.org. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. And now, a track from Mementeros. We're fucking and fucking and fucking her. The big, the butch, the gal, honey. Come in, she said, stretched out, nice and early. Good evening. That's some good pussy you've got there, he said, and watched the door close. So she does know that she's going to be let loose on me. One single word, Also, there was nothing to say. Her? She laughed. Of course. What did she say? Disrupting the expected, even if momentary. Violation. Message of the shadow, passed down from organ. Lauding. They are the same. We are the same. Seeing clearly. Waiting. Nuances create the friction that brings us closer. Transcendence into the other, the shadow, the lay of her fathers. Just be a good girl, just be a man. Had whispered as he pressed himself into her. Fourth between the two, myth and psyche, using them to provide insights for each other, preventing either from being taken on its terms only. Candy looked out the motel room window. Nade opened the door and hurried outside, down the stairs, hoping that Joe wouldn't show up until much later.